Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm gonna go into the second field of level 1, which is law and compliance. So this is just an introductory on law and compliance. Before we can say that we comply to anything, we need to know what it is that we're complying to. So sometimes it's really funny to ask people, or just ask yourself, what is law? Is law a way to secure peace? Is it a social construct? Is it general principles that we agree upon? Is it a social norm or culture like we see in terms of Me Too? Is it morality, ethics? Not always, maybe. Psychology. It might be connected to psychology in the sense that the way we write law, we have an expectation of people to behave in a certain way. So if we do something wrong in the lawmaking process, we might get a really bad result. Is it just hierarchy? Is it a way to keep order and thereby maybe peace in a region, in a nation, or in a company if it's just internal regulation or policies? Law is a lot of things, and it may depend on where you come from, what your background is, and which part of the world that you are from. So what I will try to look into are some key characteristics in the legal phase, because it's hard to define, but there are some elements that we can divide law into and thereby try to look at this construct of law and understand compliance better. So, but first we need to look into the process. So how does anything become a law? Because that, of course, has an impact on how we should interpret and comply with it. And later on, when we get to level 2 of Academic Compliance Academy, we will go to the more technical side of economics and lawmaking. But let's just stay at the more political side of everything. So how does a law become written law? Well, typically, before there's any legal action happening, we have in the EU a foundation of democracy. That is the general perception that the EU consists of democratic states, democratic nations that all are based on the simple principle that before any legal interference can happen, there must be a majority, not necessarily in the population. That would typically only be questions considering constitutional rights. But since we vote for parliament in every state, the parliament is our representatives that should be able to take decisions on our behalf. That is a democratic point of view. So the result is that we might have a principle or a policy that a majority of at least our parliament agrees upon. When you have agreed upon a policy or a principle or a new rule that derives from a principle, then this element will turn into what I call the regulatory process. That is the lawmaking process, which would typically be made by authorities. So then the legal documents will come out in the end, and they might have a binding or non-binding character. And this is where we start dividing some of the legal aspects and structures, because policies are in general not binding. That might be something that we agree upon. We agree upon the green agenda. We agree that we need to change our society, but there's no actual obligation in that. So it's kind of a vast, non-enforceable document, where if we put in some principles in our regulations, we know them from the EU law, principles of proportionality, legality, non-discrimination, etc. Well, that has a binding character and can be enforced by court. So there are different perspectives, and we will go further into this division between different legal parameters in the next couple of videos. We have to take a step back and then say, okay, so one thing is that we in the EU have a democratic process, and we have a majority that will have to agree upon something before we can put it into a legal document. If we take it to the next level, globalized, the international collaboration, we also have the UN, and we have different collaborations where the member states or signatories will have to agree also. Sometimes there's a demand of full agreement, that it's not just majority, everyone has to agree. And sometimes certain jurisdictions, nations have the veto right. So if they do not agree in terms of like the Security Council resolutions, well, they can veto and the agreement will be disabled. But in these international, we commit ourselves, we do a mutual commitment as nations, as signatories, to assign and apply certain principles in our own legislation. That might be through trade, human rights, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering issues. That is something that we apply to. We sign off a convention and say, okay, we will go into this. We will apply this to our own national legislation. So this all sounds really, really good. But democracy has one big, giant problem, and that is the problem of free riding. So even if we agree on everything, there is a common problem called free riding. Free riding is, I put out two pictures here, and you can see one jumping over on the way to the metro, not paying obviously for the ticket. In the upper picture we can see one who's not paddling or biking on the pedals and really just enjoying life. And that is the fear, because the higher up we come in the democratic process, the less enforceable mechanisms we have, well, the less control. And when we lack control and enforceable characters, we can see actions that are not in favor of everyone, in favor of society, in favor of all the signatories. So I put in here an example. A signatory state might sign an international convention on human rights, but still remain reluctant to enforce the common perception of human rights. Sometimes we even see states sign on conventions, put it in their national legislation, but just have no enforcement. Which means that the de facto character of the legal implementation of the principles, well, de facto there's no really enforcement, so nothing has happened. So the problem of democracy, and especially when we do not have enforcement mechanisms, that is that lack of control and enforcement can incentivize free riding. And that is just one big downfall. So why do we keep making laws, and why do we keep wanting to comply with laws if some nations are free riders? If not everyone does what is expected of them, why do some nations actually comply? And just also companies. Well, law is in itself based on a core assumption that people are good in origin and want to follow the law. Of course, we have enforcement mechanisms, we have punishment, we have different incentives trying to push people, corporations, member states in the right direction, so we actually see some behavior that complies with the regulatory interference that we're doing. But we need to understand that even though there might be downfalls to the democratic process and not everyone will comply, there is a slow process going on. And that is why I put this funny picture of belief, which is lie, in the middle, because we might have liars, we might have persons that do not comply, but slowly, the more we try to agree upon in this world, well, the less friction is typically coming to the surface. So we have the example of the European Union. Not everyone in the European Union are happy to be a part of it. We just had Brexit. So what was the whole aim here? If not everyone is happy to be part of it. Well, one of the key issues was also establishing not just a trade union, but also making a foundation where trade could incorporate, could depend the nations in a kind of state where there would be no incentives for warfare. And that has succeeded, even though Brexit has happened. So even though there might be free riders, even though not everyone is complying to the regulation, law does have a good sense of direction and stability, creating stability in society. And it will be a baseline for good behavior. Law is not a religion, because I put religion in the first slide where we talked about what law is, but it does have a similarity, because people are good in general and people want to be good. And we need to address that. But when we go to dynamic compliance, and the further we get, so this is law and compliance, that part of it, but the further we get, we also need to know that when we're talking risk-based regulation, risk-based compliance, what we typically focus on is the risk. There's of course always a lot of people complying with the regulation, but we focus on the risk because that is what is, it's a leftover. So that's what we need to assess and what we need to mitigate. In total, law is actually more than just written words, and we need to understand that to learn dynamic compliance, because the reactive compliance really sometimes the consideration and the perceptions were that law was the written word and you just had to comply with the exact wording in the regulation. But law is so much more. Law is a social construct and it aims at a balance, which is why we cannot just look at one piece, one statute in the regulation. We need to look at the aim with a given regulation and try to comply with that aim, and then maybe conceive the statute and all the different requirements as a way that the legislator have tried to tell us this is some of the actions that you need to do to try to reach that aim. Law is a social construct. We have designed the law. The majority designs the law. And it is for everyone, so we can assess our behavior. We can see how do we become the best persons? How do we thrive and how do we create stability, even though everyone has constraints, but we can try our best. So if we consider law more than just a written word, we come closer to understanding what compliance and dynamic compliance is. It is a part of aligning individual interests with the interests of society, but also the other way around. So this was just an introductory on law and compliance. In the next video, I will go into more specific divisions and structural things that we can look at within law and how we can actually conceive it in different angles. So stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and let's talk more about compliance.